everybody. Can I just get a thumbs up that you can see those slides, Emma? Yay, that's great. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm so pleased that we're all here talking about one of the things that I love talking about the most, which is LGBTQ plus adoption. Just a little bit about me. My name's Charlotte. My pronouns are she, her. I am an adopter. I previously fostered on an early permanent kind of plan, which ended up with a reunification back to family. And I adopted my two kiddies, who are both age 5 and 2, with my partner. So we're fully into the toddler years. I know that Emma's discussed the wellbeing stuff, so I think she pretty much covered that. There will be one video about microaggressions that is quite intersectional. So it doesn't just cover microaggressions that LGBT people experience. It goes into the experiences of all different kind of elements of identity, including race, ethnicity, but other cultural elements as well. So just be mindful of that. Look after yourselves. It's key today. Again, any questions in the chat, and we will get to those at the end. Okay, so let's dive in. So I'm from an organisation, Proud2B Parents. My full-time role is in a fostering agency, so I do work in foster care full-time. I also manage a nationwide organisation, which I hope some of you will have heard of, called LGBT Youth in Care. If you've not heard of it, then it might be one for you to just note down and have a little look at our website, because we do a lot of advocacy and support for LGBT young people with care experience. And we're very proud of that initiative. Proud2B Parents itself is a Northwest-based agency, but we do a lot of training and consultancy nationwide, and that is the longer term kind of goal of the organisation. We do all sorts of things, including training, consultancy, parents meetups, children's meetups, weekly meetups, monthly meetups, parents' nights out. We do the whole host of things. And yeah, so if you're not aware of our organisation, do check us out. I'm sure that one of the team will be putting these links in the chat as I talk. Okay, so that's me in a nutshell. I'm Proud2B Parents. So what will we cover in this less than 90 minutes now that we've got together? So we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into understanding microaggressions and unconscious bias. I'm going to weave in a lot of experience from LGBT adopters. I'll also bring in my own lived experience as well. And then we'll end on some tips for addressing microaggressions and fostering inclusivity in our practice. So to get us started, I wanted to show you a bit of a kind of graphic of the percentage of LGBT plus people who have adopted by year. I know that a lot of you may already be aware of the percentages, but I think that it's a really powerful graph, because you can see from 2007 where we've got around 2-3% of adoptions to LGBT people. And as time has gone on, the trend has gone upwards. And that is a testament to the inclusivity of organisations, to the ethos of the country that we live in, is that we're making it more, we're making it easier for LGBT people to come forward as adopters. We're getting things out there, but we still know that there's still lots of room for improvement. We don't have any data pre-2007. This is the earliest time in which the data began to be collated. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. We don't have any statistics on the amount of trans adopters. We just don't collate that nationally. So if there's anybody from Ofsted or the Department for Education who would like to have a further conversation about the types of statistics that we collect from organisations, from agencies, then I think it would be really valuable to know that, because it's a potential adoption pool that we just don't have enough data on at all about their experiences. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So anyway, I think the last couple of years, it's hovered around 17%. The pandemic had a big impact in the trend going up, as you can see. Can you see my little mouse moving? Yeah, great. But we have started to see that upward trend continuing in the 2022 stats. The 2023 stats haven't been released yet. They'll come out next year. So as we're talking about microaggressions, I thought that I would start with some of the earliest microaggressions that LGBT people faced, and that is through legislation. So the next 2 slides, I'm going to do a very, very, very quick history of LGBTQ plus legislation. And this isn't meant to be, you're going to go away as experts. This is just to kind of wet the whistle, so to speak, so you go away and do a bit more reading about these particular acts. So when we look at the pre-modern era, the Buggery Act came into force in 1533. This was enacted by Henry VIII. And it wasn't until 1967 that that fully was repealed. So it just goes to show how many centuries people who are LGBT were criminalized, okay? Throughout these next two slides, I'm going to use the term homosexuality. That is an outdated term, but I'm using it because that's the term that's used in the legislation. Okay, so just be mindful of that. So the Offences Against the Person Act in 1861 went some way in kind of repealing some of the very harsh sentences that homosexual people were criminalised for. So pre-1861, the death penalty, you could face the death penalty for being homosexual. And that was abolished in 1861, but they put in new legislation that you would get 10 years in prison. Then there was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, and this said that any male homosexual act was illegal, whether or not a witness was present. So that was really dangerous because you could be criminalised just through hearsay, for example. And there were a lot of kind of, I think Oscar Wilde was one of those that was convicted under that act. So then we fast forward to the mid 1900s. So we've got the decriminalisation movement. So the Wolfenden Report in 1957, they got together and basically said in a report that homosexuality should no longer be illegal. But it took until 1967, so it took a whole 10 years for that to actually be listened to in the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which made it no longer illegal to be homosexual. They only made laws about men. They didn't write laws about women. Female homosexuality was never, ever explicitly targeted by any legislation. It was only debated in the early 1900s, and they felt that if more women knew about being gay, that would be dangerous for women. So that's why they only targeted men. So then we moved to the LGBT rights movement. Hopefully lots of you have heard about the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969. This led to the first kind of pride group in 1970 called the Gay Liberation Front in London. And the first Pride March took place in 1972 in June, which is why we have Pride Month in June. So just some of the history of LGBT legislation. So the Adoption Act of 1976 said that lesbian and gay men were able to adopt. So it's a kind of a fallacy that you couldn't adopt as LGBT people, but you couldn't adopt together. You had to be assessed as like a single person in the eyes of the law. And it made it completely inaccessible for LGBT people because you had to be married, and you couldn't be married as LGBT people at the time. So it was very, very difficult to adopt as an LGBT person until that was reformed in the early 2000s. In 1988, Section 28 came into force. This was a very conservative policy that banned local authorities from promoting homosexuality, and they actually wrote in that act pretend family relationships. So it was a response to LGBT people creating families and the Conservative government at the time trying to take control of that. But it kind of backfired because what it led to was, again, a massive pride movement. Particularly today we're talking about adoptive parents, and the first LGBT kind of support network came into play just that same year. So as Section 28 came out, there was this big reaction, and the Lesbian and Gay Foster and Adoptive Parents Network was created in 1988. And then there's a few others. So there was a positive parenting campaign in 1990. There was the first LGBT adoption and fostering parenting conference. Then the Northern Support Group was set up in 1994, which again had the second LGBT adoption and fostering conference. And they were always talking about the rights of LGBT people and how they should have a right to foster and adopt freely. But it wasn't until 2002 that the Adoption and Children's Act came into force, which said that LGBT people could adopt and you didn't have to be married to adopt. And then just the last few here. So Civil Partnerships Act was in 2004, which meant that you could have a civil partnership. Gender Recognition Act came in 2004, which meant that trans people could apply for a gender recognition certificate. And the Equality Act in 2010 and the Same-Sex Couples Act, the Marriage Equality Act in 2014. So diving into microaggressions. So hopefully that was a bit of a whirlwind history, but it just goes to show you just how much legislation there's been against LGBT people in history. And although we're in a better space now in England, the world is still a very dangerous place for LGBT people. Okay, so microaggressions. Hopefully some of you have already heard about the term microaggression, but it's okay if you're brand new to it. So a microaggression is a very subtle, often unintentional action or behaviour. Could be a verbal comment or an action that is derogatory or discriminatory towards individual groups. So microaggressions don't just occur for LGBT people, they could be for all elements of identity, including age, ethnicity, pregnancy, maternity, etc. So I'm kind of picking up the characteristics from the Equality Act there. They are harmful because they reinforce stereotypes, and the definition of a stereotype is an oversimplified generalization of particular groups of people. And I suppose the key bit that I missed out of that definition is that they're harmful. Stereotypes don't cause any good to any groups of people. Okay. And they can create a hostile and very unwelcoming environment for people also. So what I'm going to do now is to show you a short, very short 2-minute video about microaggressions. Again, trigger warning here because it does have lots of different microaggressions within it. It is American, so bear that in mind, but you can generalize a lot of the experiences. So I'm just going to stop my screen share and share my internet screen. If I can get a thumbs up from you, Emma, that you can see that. Thank you.
People who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem.
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping...
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work...
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV...
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I touch
your
it,
hair,
please? Can I please?
is annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Okay. Let me just go back to my slides. So hopefully that was quite a hard-hitting video and a very short video, but I think it really gets to the message quite quickly. The one that chimes for me is the one where the character's sitting on the chair and they're told astrophysics, maybe you should try a less challenging major. You know, you can kind of look at the microaggressions that looked after children or adopted children face generally about, you know, trying to bring their aspirations down just because of this stereotype about looked after children and adopted children. I mean, that my son's experiencing that at the moment, and he's only in reception class. So it's important to recognise microaggressions impact lots of different groups of people. So the different types of microaggressions that people might experience. So there's lots of different ways in which microaggressions can be experienced. The first that I've got here is a microinvalidation. So that's where someone might discredit or minimize someone's experience. So, for example, I'll bring in some experience from someone I chatted to a while back, where it was said in their kind of report to panel that they do really well with girls considering they are gay. Okay, so for some, that might be disguised as a compliment to say, oh, well done, you're gay and you do really well with girls. That couple challenged that language and the way that that language was phrased, because what they should have said is they do really well with girls, or they do really well with named child, rather than bringing in their being gay. And when those people raised that, they were discredited. They were said, well, we didn't mean it we meant it to be as a compliment. You're overreacting, we're not homophobic. So that's a microinvalidation. That's invalidating someone's experience, which is valid. Okay, so that's something to be mindful of. A microassault is where you make a joke or derogatory language about an individual's identity. An example, me and my partner were asked how we thought it out, who would take the adoption leave. And for me, that was a joke about our being two women, which you would never have said that to a heterosexual couple. Okay, so that we kind of brushed over and cracked on. But these are the day-to-day kind of often unintentional, subtle behaviors that can really have an impact on our experiences through through assessment and panel. And a micro insult is an insensitive comment that disrespects a person's identity. I mean, I was speaking to someone just 2 weeks ago that were told you'll be waiting ages for a placement as gay people, and you'll likely only be placed with very hard to place children. And this was just when they were doing an initial inquiry to adopt. So that was itself a micro insult, insensitive comment that disrespects their identity. It was also an assault on their identity, saying, well, you're not good enough, so you'll have to wait, because we're going to prioritize heterosexual people over you, because we don't think that you'll be as good caregivers as them. Okay, so there's just a few lived experience examples of these different types of microaggressions. Okay, so unconscious bias. Microaggressions and unconscious bias are very closely intertwined with each other. Unconscious bias is often automatic, unintentional, grounded in stereotypes that influence our attitudes and behaviours, and often it's like deeply ingrained within our beliefs, in the way that we've been raised and the people that we've been around, and it has the ability to affect our behaviour. We all have bias. I always think of an example of a pilot who was flying over, an EDI, which is Equality, Diversity, Inclusion speaker, was flying over to America. She sat in her seat, and then the pilot's voice spoke, doing the whole welcome, where the air temperature is 17 degrees or whatever. And that pilot's voice was feminine. And her reaction sat in the seat was, women can't fly planes. Her arm hairs went up. She had this biological response. She recognized that was unconscious bias, and she had a word with herself. She was going over to America to talk about feminism. So she had a chat with herself, she excavated the bias from within herself, and she cracked on and had a lovely flight. So it's just really important to recognize we all have bias, and to own it, and to recognize when it's coming out in practice, and so that we can stop and think about how we can do things inclusively and equitably as we progress with that assessment or panel process. Okay, so I'm going to show you a short video about unconscious bias. Some of you may have watched this before in like equality, diversity, inclusion training, or even on onboarding for the company that you work for. It is only short, so it won't take up too much of your time. So just bear with me as I share my other screen. Can I just get a thumbs up, Emma? We're good?
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10p. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10p. The answer is actually 5p. Many of us choose 10p without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias.
I'm just going to pause it on that still because effectively the video is finished, and you might want to take a little picture of this still, because I think that these 4 bits of advice are really important, especially to those panel members here today who might be thinking about the questions that they ask LGBT adopters, to be thinking about, are they appropriate? Are they grounded in a microaggression or a stereotype? Are they actually asking the question that relates to the caregiving capacity or is it an over curiosity of how that LGBT person lives their life? So slowing down the decision-making process, reconsidering reasons for those decisions, questioning whether we've let cultural stereotypes come into our practice, and monitoring each other. And it's not about saying, oh, you're a homophobe or you're a transphobe. It's about pulling people together, and we're going to have a breakout space about this in a moment, about how we can effectively question each other for unconscious bias and be monitoring each other. Okay. So, how do unconscious bias and microaggressions impact each other? So, unconscious bias often leads to a manifestation of microaggression. So I've got this handy graphic here that I put together. And it can result in unintentional discriminatory behaviours and remarks that target marginalised groups. This isn't just LGBT people, but today we're talking about LGBT adopters. So here we've got just some of the potential outcomes. We've got frustration, emotional distress, self-doubt, negative impact on mental health, isolation, mistrust, just to name but a few. That is nowhere near an exhaustive list. It's just some of the key ones. Okay. Right, so what I want to go through now before our breakout space activity is I've just got 3 slides of examples of microaggressions. These are quite hard hitting. I'm not going to read them out to you because it can be a bit much me just talking at you all of the time. So I'm going to give you a minute or so just to read these 4, and then I'm going to talk on a couple of the points. Okay, so just give you a minute just to digest those. So I read that slowly, so I'm going to start elaborating on a couple of the points. So the first one, being asked intrusive questions about sexuality or gender identity. So we were asked by our assessing social worker how we would describe our gender roles in the house. And we had a giggle, we had a really good relationship with our assessing social worker, and she laughed and said, I probably shouldn't have asked you that question, should I? It was in this book. So it's just being mindful of the list of questions that you do have. Can you have a little audit and think about whether or not they're still, of the times? Because it implied to us that they wanted an answer that fit with like the stereotypical, well, I take the manly role of doing the DIY or the bins, and she does all the more feminine things, when we know that that's not real world, and it's not real world for heterosexual couples either. So it's just being mindful of that. The other one there, are you going to have the surgery? Of the trans people that we've spoken to, this seems to be like a common over-curious question. Of course, it's important to ask about future impacts that might impact the stability of that link or the match. But the most gender-affirming surgery takes place for people who aren't trans, things like breast reduction, breast enlargements, cellulite removal. Most of the gender-affirming surgery is for non-trans people. So if we're going to ask people about future surgery, we should be asking all people about future surgery, or stick to that general question of, are there any major life things coming up in the next 12 to 18 months that we need to be aware of, which we would ask anyway. This one here, not recognising partners, I would hope that that would never happen, but just to give you my lived experience as an adopter, I took my daughter to hospital in January, and it was visiting time, and I was held back at the door, and they said, Mum's already in the room. And I said, I'm Mum too. And it took them ages to figure it out. And even then, when it came to paperwork, they said, what should we put you down as? And I, again, said Mum. So these are things that come up all of the time for LGBT people that you might not necessarily relate with if you're not LGBT yourself. So again, I'm just going to give you a moment just to read through these ones. Just to elaborate on the top one, misinformation about gay men not having fertility issues. So it's not okay to assume that gay men haven't attempted to create their own family and don't have fertility issues. So some gay men that we've spoken to have said that they were never asked that question, when it's always asked of heterosexual couples. So that's something to be mindful of. We've got another one here, being asked to provide proof of their relationship. It might surprise some of you to know a panel member asked a question about an LGBT couple, and the assessing social worker said, I've not seen them be gay together. I know they don't seem gay, but they assure me they are. So again, that was rooted in a stereotype of gay people having to act a particular way. And then here again, lack of services. Sorry, we don't have a gender neutral facility. So it's our duty under the Equality Act to make sure that we're meeting the needs of people. And if we're working with particularly trans and non-binary applicants, that we have to make sure that the services that we're providing for them are inclusive and equitable. The last slide now before we are going to dive into the breakout spaces. So if you just read through these last four. So it's likely that we'll talk a bit more about the question about having positive role models in the Q&A, because it seems to have been something that came up a lot in previous webinars. Of course, we should be asking, all adopters about the role models that will be available to young people. But we know that LGBT people particularly are being targeted about how they're going to create gendered role models for the children that they care for. I personally wasn't asked that in panel, but we know that gay men seem to be having that question asked of them more around how they'll provide a female role model. So again, there seems to be kind of a misrep. Gay men and gay women seem to be having different experiences around the microaggressions that they face. Here we've got doubting sexuality and or gender identity as novel or trendy. Oh, it might be a phase. And we know from there's only been a very few pieces of research around the experiences of trans and non-binary applicants, but we know that their experiences have been really poor, and some have experienced blocks at stage 1. They've not been allowed to progress to stage 2 because they've been asked to go and have some therapy around exploring their gender identity, because the medical the medical practitioner panel wanted more data because they just didn't understand how they could be trans, basically. There's also panel responses about how a trans person might cause confusion for children, which is not backed up by any of the research. So probably going to be 2 minutes late for breakout rooms. Emma, I hope that we're going to be okay. So as I've touched on research, I think I'll go through this research before the breakout space. So we know that most agencies have little to no experience of assessing and supporting trans applicants, and non-binary people in particular have been disproportionately disadvantaged by people's lack of awareness and understanding around gender. But what the data says is that children's psychological well-being is just the same when children are adopted by lesbian or gay couples compared to heterosexual couples. And adopted gay fathers, this is really up-to-date research, show a similar quality of parenting to both lesbian mothers and heterosexual parents. So when we're letting these stereotypes and microaggressions come in, particularly towards gay men, I want you to be thinking about this research, that they show similar quality of parenting to both lesbian mothers and heterosexual parents. So they can be both fatherly and motherly. Okay. We know that although LGBT families experience stigma, it's the family process rather than the structure that's most associated with the outcomes. Okay, so it's the process, their experiences through life, not the fact that they are LGBT, but their experience through life that is associated with individual outcomes. We all need to work together to make sure that our practice is supportive to promote well-being. And then the last two here from First for Adoption. So adopted children of lesbian and gay parents don't experience greater problems at school and in peer relationships compared to children of heterosexual parents. And bullying and teasing is rare. Things are getting much better. And lesbian and gay adopters are more likely than heterosexual adopters to have come to adoption as their first choice. 1 minute behind, we're doing well. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and rather than like us coming into every single one of your rooms to drop these questions in the chat, I think a lot of us will probably have one of these handy, our iPhone. So if you can just take a quick snip of these two questions, it's going to be easier than us dropping into every single space. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to open up that camera, and then I'm going to hand over to the team who are going to put us into breakout spaces to answer these two questions. So how can we create a more inclusive and affirming environment for LGBTQ plus adopters and their children within social work practice? And what steps can social work practitioners take to challenge unconscious bias and address microaggressions constructively with their colleagues? Everyone back with us. That 15-minute went really quick. I think some of us could have done with another 10. I jumped into quite a few of the groups, and there was such a rich amount of conversations going on. What I think might be really useful, especially as there were a lot of discussions about how important peer spaces are to discuss, it might be really useful to put any of your key tips or any of the key themes that came out in your chats into the chat. We don't have time to reflect on every conversation that everyone had, but I think that we could possibly export the chat, Emma, in some way and get that to the people who are here today. So any of those like key bits of information or advice or things from your experience, do just start dropping those in the chat. I just pull up a few things that came up in the session. So Someone said more training like this is be really valuable and training is so important. Someone was talking about how language and terminology changes all of the time, so it'd be good to know where to go to grab that stuff. And I can recommend Stonewall. Stonewall has up-to-date glossary on their website, so that'd be a good one to put on your like intranets. Someone said representation in videos and photos, so going back, doing a little equality impact assessment, auditing what you've got there, make sure it's truly inclusive and diverse. Making sure that you utilize social media all year round, not just in Pride Month. Someone said that they have an intranet top tips and that they had like a top tip of including their pronouns in their email sign off. I think that's really nice. Like if you've got someone within the organization who could take that role about filtering out top tips, that would be really good. Someone said asking the right questions, you know, so you making sure that you know which questions are appropriate and how to ask the questions by still getting the information that you need, but making sure it's appropriately using appropriate terminology and language. And someone was talking about medical advisors do ask for information early on in the assessment, and particularly around trans and non-binary applicants. There is a practice note called Practice Note 69 from Core and Bath that I'm sure someone will drop in the chat. I think if you're members, it's free, but if not, it's £2.50. And it gives you some top tips about assessing and supporting trans applicants, because there may be moments where their dead name, which is the name they previously used, might pop up. And it's important to be aware of that and to work with them, not kind of to them. And then you were talking about steps you can take. So someone talked about how having these slides in peer supervision would be really valuable, and that lots of people might have stereotypical viewpoints. So having those statistics and up-to-date research is really good to say, well, the research says this. Also, someone made a really good point about LGBTQ plus phobic parents not agreeing to the match, and how you could work with the parents, and how some LGBT families were a little bit worried about the reaction of parents. I definitely was a concern for me. Someone was talking about less experienced workers, maybe not having the skills and the knowledge to embed the ethos across the organisation, and high turnover of staff. That's a really interesting point. And ultimately, the key point is that relationships are really important. If you're going to have quality conversations with people, the relationships that you have with your colleagues are key. Okay, it's got to be positive. So I hope that some more bits come in the chat. I'm going to open my slides back up because I'm conscious of time. So we did kind of touch on implications for children in that question 1 in the breakout spaces. So yeah, children of LGBT people do experience microaggressions because they themselves are part of the LGBT community by default. So they may internalize the microaggressions, and that might contribute to a sense of shame or self-doubt. They might witness their parent experience a microaggression, which could cause anxiety, you know. I always talk about this example. I was in Sainsbury's and my toddler was having a meltdown, and the cashier said, "Oh, your husband's got it easy at home." So that in itself is a microaggression, because it's an assumption that I'm straight, that he has a dad at home. And then we're talking about my gayness instead of paying for my shopping and getting out of there with my screaming toddler. So there is just one example of those day-to-day experiences that we as a family just have to navigate. And then also potentially educational challenges. Another example of my son, they had Ofsted not that long ago, and a governor asked about mum and dad at home. The governor didn't know about Riley's family setup, and he owned it. He said, "I've got a mummy and a mama." And she went, "Oh, okay." And then all of the staff then go red and panic. And then they called me up to say, "This just happened," when it could have been avoided by just using inclusive language such as grown-ups. You know, we would always advocate for using the term grown-ups, because lots of children have a parental loss or are raised by their grandparents or are looked after children. There's so many benefits to just using your grown-ups at home. So yeah, that's just another example. But we shouldn't assume that all children are going to be these anxious, stressed balls of mess because they've got LGBT parents. The research shows us that these instances are can be rare, and they are proud because we raise them to be proud. of being who they are, and our efforts should be less in how are you as LGBT parents going to cope with all of this. It should be how can we as practitioners make the world a more inclusive place? How can we work with schools to make sure their language is inclusive? How can we work with panel, the medical advisors, to make sure that these things don't happen in the first place, because they shouldn't. Okay, so I'm just thinking about time. I'm going to go through the 10 recommendations and then see if we've got time to share you a 6-minute video before the Q&A. So 10 recommendations to address microaggressions and to support LGBT adopters. So number 1, visual signs and symbols. So you can wear or include like the pride symbols to promote safe spaces. Personally, I know if there's a pride flag in the space, I'm instantly disarmed. I know that that organisation has thought about me and my existence. I can be out and proud in that space, and I don't have to worry about facing these like microaggressions or bias in that space. You can have books, posters, brochures, and other materials at your disposal. There's some great books around LGBT adoption, which I'm sure Cora and Bath have got on a recent post they put actually for LGBT adoption and fostering week in March, so that might be able to be linked in here. So you could have those books at hand during assessment to pass over so that LGBT adopters can read different experiences. Number 2, avoid assumptions. So we talked about this a lot already, haven't we? So don't assume someone's identity, ask open questions and use broad and inclusive terminology. And if you're unsure, it's okay, and feel confident to ask. What we want is a workforce that is confident to work with LGBT people, because often doing nothing can cause more harm than doing something, okay? I've spoken to some people who've said, well, I wouldn't know how to assess a trans applicant. I think I'd just sweep it under the carpet, which to me is a big problem, because that means you're potentially losing a fantastic adopter for children, okay? What we need is to avoid assumptions around, upskill ourselves to make sure that we can do the best possible we can for LGBT people. Validate the impact of discrimination. It's so important to recognise and validate the impact of that on people's experiences. They may, your applicants may have experienced discrimination that have a significant impact on their mental health. So it's really important to validate that and to make sure that there are support networks available to them. Not all LGBT people will want to go to a support group, but I know just how affirming it is when I go into a room full of other LGBT families. It just makes me feel wonderful and proud. Focus on strength, resilience, and pride. So the previous slide, I was talking about my son's experiences of microaggressions because of me being gay. But what we should be focusing on is the strength and resilience of pride that we have as a family unit to navigate the world as LGBT people. It's really powerful. Recognise the positive impact that LGBT affirming communities can have on your service users. And I know I've talked about it on point 3, just making sure that you're aware of the services available, so you can signpost your LGBT adopters to groups to share lived experience. Adoption UK have a group. I know that New Family Social have groups, and lots of people sign up to that as well. So there's lots of different areas. Proud2B Parents, of course, there's loads of different places you can tap into support. Understanding an individual's intersectionality. I hope it was quite clear in the microaggressions video. Intersectionality is so important that we should be understanding that different elements of identity can intersect and impact the ways and the experiences that individuals have. So we should avoid assumptions that an applicant has a specific stance on religion or political beliefs based on them being LGBT, because there's stereotypes that all LGBT people are liberals, and that might not necessarily be the case. So it's important not to make assumptions on different intersecting identities. Okay, so the last 5 recommendations. So learn about LGBT culture. So we can't know everything from a 90-minute webinar. Go away with the resources that will be signposted to. Think about how you can embed a more inclusive ethos in your organisations that you work in. Number 7, so service users should not need to educate you. So don't expect LGBT adopters to educate you on their experiences. but listen if they choose to share. So it's great to have the spaces and the peer groups for them to share experiences, but it's not okay to just go, oh, well, they're gay, let's get them to do some gay training for us because they're gay and they'll be the best people to do it. We need to make sure that they've got the experience needed, the skills needed to deliver training, and also the knowledge to deliver that. Ensure forms are inclusive. So that's doing an order. Does your application form ask to tick in a male or female box? Is it inclusive to all genders? Is there an option to self-describe your gender? Because often these are the first roadblocks that particularly trans people face and think, well, these don't know that non-binary people exist, so I'm going to have a real problem with them. I'm going to try and do some research and maybe go to a different local authority or a different adoption agency. Consider your own bias and privilege. We were talked about that in the unconscious bias element. So work to identify and understand where your experiences are impacting your practice, recognizing your own privilege in the world. That can be really uncomfortable. I mean, I know I've had some uncomfortable conversations with myself, but it's so important, and then you'll be a better ally and advocate for it. And finally, seek additional training and consultation. You could, if you're interested, get in touch with Proud2B Parents. We would love to do some bespoke training. We can do training over full day, half day. We can do it all. So do seek additional training and consultation. I'm going to just show you this last graphic. You may have seen this before, but basically we're looking for a service where LGBT adopters are assessed and recruited with liberation in mind. Okay, if we treat everybody the same, we're inevitably excluding some. So this is, for example, if we're having an in-person panel, we've got a non-binary applicant. We've not asked them which toilets they will be most comfortable using. We don't have a gender neutral facility available where we've booked the panel to be. We're treating everybody the same because there's a male and a female toilet, but we're inevitably excluding one of our members. If we make it fair, then yeah, okay, so we're going to make sure that there's a gender neutral toilet available to them. So we'll make sure we book somewhere with a gender neutral toilet. But what we need is liberation. So we need services to be thinking about non-binary people from the outset when you're building buildings, to make sure that things are accessible and inclusive to all. That's just one example, but you could use this graphic in, when you're looking or supervising, or if you're looking at peer supervision, when you're reflecting back on a decision you've made or a phrase in a report. How can we make sure that this is equitable and truly fair for LGBT people? Okay, Emma, I think that we should prioritize the Q&A. The video is long, it's 6 minutes, but could we share it with the attendees, or would you like me to share it?